Hmm. Well, hello everyone. Nice to see so many people coming in to join us for today's event. We're just giving everyone like a minute or so to filter in. Maybe as people are just joining us, you could say hello and tell us where you're joining from today. And we'll get going in just about a minute as that starts to peter off a little bit. So I can start off by saying that I'm here in Amsterdam, and all our panelists are also all over the place. So I think this will be also quite an international group. I can already see from some of the names that I recognize. Um, All right, nice. Well, already Maine, Slovenia, Berlin, Kentucky. That's great. All over the place. Well, I think people will continue to kind of keep joining for the next couple of minutes, but I think we'll kick off because we have a really rich and full session ahead of us. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Claudia Schweiss. I'm the founder and the CEO of Democracy Next. For those of you who might be new to DemNext, we are an international research and action institute focused on broadening who has power and how decisions are taken in government, but also other organizations like museums and schools, universities and banks. And all of these kind of decision-making processes being based on the principles that underpin citizens' assemblies, meaning sortition, randomly selecting decision makers, deliberation, and the rotation of power. So I'm delighted to give a few welcome remarks before I pass it over to Josh Burgess, who will be moderating today, and my colleagues James and Hannah, who will be presenting our new paper published today about going from project to permanence. I'm not going to go into the details of the paper itself because they're going to do that. I'm just going to take a minute or two to step back and say that this work is really coming together in a bigger picture with other elements that we've been working on for the past 4 years at Democracy Next. How do we actually make systemic change to another democratic paradigm that shifts power to citizens happen? Well, it's a lot of hard work, mostly relational work with the capacity building, network and ecosystem weaving, strategic communications, which is beginning to shift norms, together with that legal and institutional side of building institutions. And all of that takes time, but bears inspiring ripple effects. And this paper, drawing on learnings from 4 cities and regions in different contexts across 3 continents, highlights a core part of all of that. I emphasize the relational part in this little opening, as I've been deeply inspired by all the people in all of these places that have been ambitious, visionaries leading the charge, because it's ultimately people that make change happen. It doesn't magically come from nowhere. Behind the scenes are elected officials, public servants, democracy practitioners, facilitators, and citizens who are step by step showing that another democratic future really is possible. There's an approach here that, taken together with the ideas that we've been exploring in other places on what makes scaling catalyst organizations effective for spreading democratic innovations, as well as how does AI and technology fit into all of this, that is crystallizing into clarity about an approach that works and is scalable to more places. Local investment into civic and democratic infrastructure, people's skills, networks, and physical places, supported by technology that strengthens rather than weakens people's deliberative muscles, lays the foundations for communities that have greater agency in shaping decisions that affect them and greater democratic resilience. So, from projects to permanence, from citizen participation to power. Now, I don't want to give away too much of the ending of what James and Hannah's presentation will go through, so I'm going to pass over to them to explain more about what we've been up to in our cities program later. And first, I'll pass it over to Josh Burgess, who will introduce our fantastic speakers, as well as himself, and a little bit about how this event will go today. So over to you, Josh.
Thanks so much, Claudia. Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see everyone here in the panel. Of course, we can't see all of your lovely faces, but we can imagine the wonderful diversity and energy in this virtual room. Just a quick reminder that we are in a webinar, so you will have a chat open, and we love to have a rich conversation going on in there. If you do have specific questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function for that. Once again, just a quick introduction. I get to wear a few different hats these days. I'm the executive director of the Central Oregon Civic Action Project. You'll hear us call that COCAP. I'm also a senior advisor for U.S. programs with Democracy Next, and also newly the managing director of democracy initiatives at the Global Development Incubator. So today I'm coming at this both as, I guess, someone who has helped build one of our four case studies in this paper, but someone who also is genuinely interested in hearing more from the other locations. Just a quick bit on the COCAP origin story. A few years back, Claudia was actually here in Central Oregon giving a presentation on citizens' assemblies. And one of our city councilors was in the audience, Anthony Broadman, who's now a state senator, and walked out thinking, wait, why aren't we doing more of this here? As did everyone in the room, I think. That one spark turned into essentially months of me knocking on doors, literally sitting down with individuals, with Rotary clubs, youth groups, county commissioners, with Tammy, who became an instant champion and ambassador for us. And that was long before we ever announced that we were actually going to have a public assembly. And it was slow, rather unglamorous, relational work, which that's exactly why, though, when we finally launched our first assembly on youth homelessness, we had real cross-partisan and cross-societal buy-in instead of just a project that would be sort of a one-off. And since then, COCAP has grown from that one-time pilot with a good idea into something that does look a lot more like democratic infrastructure. We're now fiscally sponsored by our Regional Council of Governments. We've got a partner network of more than a dozen civic, education, and business organizations. This spring, we hosted a Civic Action Summit with more than 50 leaders from across the region and the US. And we've even had outreach from the governor's office and our state senate calling to ask how civic assemblies might help with statewide policy questions. And we've even now kicked off on our second civic assembly, which will be about how decisions should be made about artificial intelligence in governance. But the whole point of today is that we're just one story of four. This paper will also take us to Vilnius, Lithuania, where a citizens' assembly on urban mobility helped to spark a whole new Nordic-Baltic network of practitioners. It takes us to Esch-sur-Alzette in Luxembourg, where in a city with 5 languages spoken on any given street corner, an assembly figured out how to make multilingualism a feature and not a barrier, and got cross-partisan political backing before a single citizen ever walked in the door. And it takes us to Kerewan in the Gambia's North Bank region, where organizers traveled to 42 villages to build one of the most creative sortition processes we've ever seen. And in doing so, helped launch an entire new network for deliberative democracy across Africa. Four very different places, four different budgets, four different politics, but the same underlying question: what does it actually take to turn a single assembly into something permanent? And that's where we're going to dig into. So before I hand it over to James and Hannah, I'm going to just give you quick introductions. We do have Satang Dumbuya, who is a social justice activist focused on promoting gender equity and youth empowerment in the Gambia. She was one of the lead facilitators of the North Bank Region Citizens Assemblies in Kerewan. We also have Beatrice Umbrasete, who was the lead organizer of the Vilnius Citizens Assembly and works as one of the key advisors to the chief architect at the Vilnius City Municipality. We've got Tammy Baney, the executive director of the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council. Tammy leads regional collaboration in transportation, workforce development, economic development, natural resources, community resilience, not much on her plate. She's also a former Deschutes County Commissioner, recognized for building partnerships that really strengthen our communities. Alex Lehman was an assembly member from our Deschutes County Assembly on Youth Homelessness. He was born and raised in Oregon, currently works as a shift leader at an ammunition manufacturer, and he's also since joined our regional steering committee for Central Oregon's Civic Action Project, and he's passionate about bringing people together to strengthen our communities. We may have Anka, hopefully in a bit, who is also an assembly member from Esch. She's a compliance officer working in sort of between in-house leadership and advisory training for compliance professionals. And now I will hand it over to James, who is the city's program lead for DemNext, responsible for all things city related, including managing collaborations with cities around the world to broaden and deepen citizen participation, and Hannah Terry, who has been working very closely with James to deliver the city's program and more recently been deeply involved in Democracy Next work on more than human governance. So I will hand it over to the two of you now and be back with you in a bit.
Thank you so much, Josh, and thank you for everybody for being here today. Really excited to be able to share this with you. So I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. Should be working there. So yeah, thank you to everyone who's joining us today from different parts of the world. I have to say this feels really special, especially for Hannah and I, as we've worked really hard over the last few years to deliver the cities program. We've been fortunate enough to do this alongside an incredible team at DemocracyNext and many, many collaborators from all over the world. This is really a culmination of this work, and we're super happy to be able to share what we did, but more importantly, what we learned. So let's get started. So cities are messy, complex, diverse, beautiful places. They're also where most people live in our world. So from the neighborhoods that we live in to the public services we have access to, how we move around, cities and regions are places where decision-making impacts us greatly. At the same time, most people don't have opportunities to truly shape these decisions. Research consistently shows trust in politicians and decision-making processes is actually declining. We see this at all levels of government, but also cities and regions. We really believe that part of rebuilding that trust means that our democratic institutions need to evolve to reflect 21st century realities and introduce meaningful ways for people to shape the decisions affecting their communities. We believe that citizens' assemblies offer a way to tackle this when they're embedded as part of our democratic infrastructure, by establishing them as institutions rather than one-off events. This means that they're both embedded in law through parliamentary rules or binding policy frameworks, and that they prompt a shift in the norms and cultures of engagement. But how do we get there? Specifically when working in the context of implementing a citizens' assembly for the first time. This is what we're here to talk to you about today. So setting an intention for longevity, for institutionalization from the start, it requires a completely different mindset. As our colleague Josh has pointed out, it's better to think of it as a marathon, not as a sprint. In the following presentation, we'll explain what this looks like in practice and what we learned along the way. But first, it's important to say how we got here. Besides keeping track of all the things we've learned over the last 3 years, we took the time to speak to 22 different people across the 4 assemblies that we were involved in. From the decision makers to facilitators, civil servants to assembly members, we held in-depth interviews with each of them as we drafted the paper. And then off the back of this, we've organized our reflections into 3 parts. First, guiding principles and sort of key takeaways from DemocracyNext Cities program. Second, we tease out what we learned from advising 2 cities and 2 regions across 3 continents. And third, we offer recommendations for 3 audiences: cities, civil society, and funders. So I'll pass it over to my colleague Hannah here to present this part of the presentation.
Yeah, so I'll start off with a short overview of the DemocracyNext Cities program itself, why we launched it, who we worked with, our role, and what investment into these ecosystems actually looks like. Why do we launch the program? Well, from data, we know that more than 2/3 of citizens' assemblies counted by the OECD have taken place at local and regional levels of government. They've tackled subjects like the environment, urban and strategic planning, health, and infrastructure. Citizens' assemblies are also no longer niche. There are now over 1,000 examples of assemblies worldwide to draw lessons from, but only around 25 of these are actually institutionalized. With this in mind, our approach started from the desire to work with cities, regions, and civil society organizations that were ready to implement an assembly for the first time, but also that had the ambition to institutionalize. Technically launched before the cities program, but ultimately running in parallel was a collaboration with Deschutes County, Oregon. As Josh introduced COCAP, we heard about kind of this long process of securing support, funding, not only to bring one assembly to Oregon, but also to build deeper democratic infrastructure. And that process is still going on, as we're going to hear about later. And the 3 other places we worked at were within the city's program, which built upon a vision laid out in a position paper that we developed in 2023. It was written with an international task force of people from around the world who helped us develop 6 proposals for democratizing city planning, and citizens' assemblies were a key role in that paper. Off the back of that, we put out an open call for applications to collaborate with DemocracyNext, ultimately to make systemic changes into how decisions are made in our cities. We wanted to work with municipal governments, civil society organizations, or other stakeholders like developers to do this. And in the end, we received 23 applications from 17 countries around the world and selected 3 partners. Those were Esch in Luxembourg, the Great Green Wall Frontline Initiative in the Gambia, and Vilnius in Lithuania. They were selected through a rigorous interview process where they expressed an enthusiasm and a willingness to make systemic changes on how decisions are made. They had high-level support from the start, both political and administrative, and they were able to identify a topic that the first assembly would tackle. They also represented diverse conditions, scales, and contexts to work in. And because Democracy Next is not a practitioner organization, meaning we don't actually facilitate assemblies ourselves, our role involved advising on the overall design, connecting to partners with global practitioners, mapping and identifying allies, all while building this capacity for each partner to do this on their own in the future. We started off by running a 9-module learning program with key people involved in each assembly to build their knowledge and confidence needed to design and implement a citizens' assembly for the first time. We also then worked with them individually to contextualize the learnings and co-design a tailored approach. For all 3 partners in the cities program, we also coordinated training for facilitators and organizers in close collaboration with deliberative assembly facilitators from around the world, including Shared Future, We Do Democracy, and What About Dem? Overall, our intention was to catalyze local ecosystems of people and organizations to carry this work forward and become scaling catalysts in their own context. We believe this is one of the key ingredients for laying the groundwork for institutionalization. And of course, this looks different in each place. So in Vilnius, we organized a facilitation workshop delivered by We Do Democracy, which included democracy practitioners from all of the Baltic countries and from a few Nordic countries. This led to the Nordic Deliberative Democracy Network deciding to include Baltic countries into their network. And this group is now working closely, exploring funding opportunities, sharing regional lessons, methods, and skills development in deliberative democracy. We also heard about COCAP, a county-wide civic engagement organization, and then in the spring of 2026, they hosted a 2.5-day Civic Action Summit. It was attended by more than 50 government and civil society leaders from Central Oregon and across the US, and that created an opportunity for shared learning and building alliances. In the Gambia, following the assembly, we convened practitioners from across Africa in Banjul to exchange insights, map out key actors, and develop plans to launch an African network for deliberative democracy, which has now been formalized as the Kacha Network. And it includes practitioners, funders, and academics that are interested in expanding and developing citizens' assemblies in African contexts. And finally, in Esch, where the assembly wrapped up about 3 weeks ago, we already organized an institutionalization workshop to sketch out a framework for Esch to create an institutionalized assembly. And this was done with representatives from a French and a Belgian permanent assembly who were able to share their lessons and insights with Esch. And of course, working across diverse contexts with little to no experience in delivering assemblies meant that we needed to approach each collaboration with intention and care. It wasn't always easy in practice, but there were 5 key principles that guided how we worked with each partner to deliver the program. We tried to integrate these principles into our working relationships, including how we communicated with partners, how we took decisions, and ultimately how each assembly was designed and implemented.
So in doing all of this, we learned a lot about what it takes to start building new democratic infrastructure. Next, we'll share with you the things that went well, the challenges we encountered, and offer some reflections on how things could have been done differently. So this includes 8 different lessons. The first being that building widespread community, institutional, and cross-partisan political support is an essential starting point to any assembly. In Deschutes, Josh, the lead organizer of the assembly there, spent months meeting with key people before the assembly was publicly announced. But ultimately, that work paid off as both elected bodies held public votes and agreed to endorse the assembly process, receive the recommendations, and then formally respond to them publicly. In Vilnius, the municipality's internal organizing team worked hard to ensure that there was support from the mayor and the vice mayor from the beginning. While in the Gambia, a lesson is that we should have worked a little bit harder to engage decision makers sooner. Given that this process was initiated by a local NGO and not a government, ensuring that political support from the beginning was even more important. That said, while we did engage with stakeholders later in the process, they were present during the recommendation handover, and at the time they expressed support for the outcomes of the assembly. But we're seeing that the work of following up with them is still ongoing and still requires work. In Esch, Marcus Meeson, Associate Professor of Urban Regeneration and Chair of the City of Esch, helped to galvanize that early political buy-in for the Citizens Assembly and connected us directly with the Mayor and the General Secretary from the beginning. And this ensured from the start that we had the highest level of support. Second lesson relates to democratic infrastructure and how it's strengthened by cultivating these ecosystems and building practitioner capacity. So, as we mentioned, we've learned that cultivating ecosystems acts as a catalyst for the sustainability of this work. Part of this involved connecting partners to local practitioners and regional and international networks of people working in deliberative democracy. And we saw that in Deschutes, where Josh spoke about this already, the Central Oregon Civic Action Project is sharing this experience and inspiring other levels of government, and has become really a learning site for civic leaders across Oregon and the US wanting to do the same. Whereas the assembly in the Gambia, which was one of the focal points for that regional convening of African democracy practitioners, is sharing its lessons from the assembly and have inspired organizers from South Africa's first Citizens Assembly, which is taking place in Cape Town. Organizers also in the Gambia have built their own knowledge and skills to run a sortition process in their context and have the know-how to deliver future citizens' assemblies. In Vilnius, through the assembly, one of the lead facilitators is now involved in 2 more assemblies taking place in other Lithuanian municipalities, while representatives from the national government had their eye on the Vilnius assembly as they consider implementing one at the country level. And then finally in Esch, by connecting to and collaborating with key people throughout the process, and building the municipality's capacity to organize the process, a stronger Luxembourgish ecosystem of deliberative democracy practitioners is starting to emerge. The third lesson is the institutionalization, when taken as an approach from the beginning, tends to make the relationships between people in power less antagonistic and often breaks down the civil service silos that people end up working within. So that work to garner widespread cross-partisan and cross-departmental support for establishing a citizens' assembly ends up having other knock-on effects. So by taking the institutionalization approach, it can end up leading to collaboration between siloed departments. So for example, in Esch, the city's general secretary, as well as colleagues from the departments of urban planning, social services, and the environment, all came together to collectively define the assembly question, along with city councilors from both the government and the opposition. These departments also gave coordinated feedback on the assembly members' draft recommendations before they were finally voted on. In Vilnius, we also saw that the chief city architects team worked in close collaboration with the mobility department in preparing the assembly together as it focused on the future of mobility in the city. Fourth, communications is an investment that benefits more than a single assembly. Never underestimate the power of a good story. A solid communication strategy is always essential. So we saw that communications really has a different job at different stages in the process. Before the assembly, organizers need to ensure that through building public awareness, people will actually respond to the assembly invitations once they're sent out. We really learned how important this is. In Esch and Vilnius, their comms team included traditional and social media, as well as physical signage throughout the cities, and the response rate to the assembly invitations were over 5%. Whereas in Deschutes, where there was a lack of social media presence, we saw a slightly lower response rate, around 2.5%. Of course, there's many factors that play into this, but communications is really a big one. In the Gambia, awareness was built during the sortition process specifically, which involved 3 days of traveling to 42 different villages across the North Bank region to randomly select people for the second stage of the civic lottery. This was a heavy lift. It involved talking to over 200 people, explaining the process, why it was happening in the first place, and how it was important for the communities. But ultimately, that slow communication style ended up building a wider awareness across the region. Finally, or next, during the assembly, it's also important to continue actively communicating, including regular updates on social media, through photos from sessions, as well as live streaming plenary sessions. Then finally, after the assembly, it's essential to communicate the impact it had. Inviting journalists to follow the process from the beginning can help bring out those human stories behind the assembly. For example, personal stories of who the assembly members were, what changed for them, why they decided to join. This is what can make the process feel tangible to people who are not part of it. Building the community's understanding is not only an investment in public awareness, but it also generates excitement for about the next time that they might find a letter in their mailbox.
And next, independent evaluation is essential. It's necessary for reassuring assembly members and the wider public that the process is legitimate, but it also ensures that there is learning to inform iteration over time. When we speak about institutionalization, we don't mean anchoring into one approach forever, but we want there to be learning and improvement, so we need that independent evaluation to offer those insights. And in all the cases we're discussing today, the assemblies were independently evaluated. Long-term systemic change also requires funding for capacity building and network weaving, not just an assembly. So this means an investment into the variety of actors needed to make an assembly happen. We make the case in the paper for philanthropic funders to direct their resources towards capacity building, whether in catalyst organizations or in developing practitioners across the field. And when that ecosystem is thriving and exists, governments are better positioned to fund a deliberative process directly without having to cover the additional costs of building capacity. Technology should be integrated early and not as an afterthought. Deliberative technologies, what we are starting to call delib tech, are being deployed in new ways to enhance deliberation and strengthen people's capacities to deliberate. In both Deschutes and Esch, we tested different tools, and through both cases, we learned that integrating tech into a facilitation team's workflow requires time, trust, and experimentation. For example, in Esch, the facilitation team tested the platform DemBrain in their weekly team meeting leading up to the assembly. So this helped them get comfortable with the tool, troubleshoot, and discover the possibilities of using it during the assembly. We've learned that technology, when used well, can make the process easier to deliver, improve quality of deliberation, and create the opportunity for more interesting communications assets like voice-based outputs. And finally, multilingualism is a strength. It can help create a sense of belonging and a feeling of solidarity between assembly members. There was an element of multilingualism in 3 out of the 4 cases we're talking about today, and we learned how this can be a strength rather than a hindrance, especially when you design for it from the start. This ensures that the assembly is inclusive and representative. In Vilnius, the assembly took place in Lithuanian, but organizers provided interpreters to translate into the languages needed, so English, Russian, and Ukrainian. In the Gambia, facilitators worked in 3 languages, Wolof, Maninka, and English. And in Esch, the assembly had 3 working languages as well, Luxembourgish, English, and French, although they also had a few other languages that they were interpreting for. In each case, we saw multilingualism contribute to a sense of social cohesion by creating a shared political space where people from different backgrounds could recognize each other as coming from the same community and working towards the same goal.
We also think it's worth sharing a separate but really important lesson here as well, and that's that impact is not only confined to policy. We shouldn't only look at the success of an assembly through the lens of its ability to shift policy or decision-making. Of course, that's important, But there's another tangible outcome that comes from taking part in such a process that's worth calling out. And that's the impact the Assembly has on its members and organizers, and it can be significant. Across each Assembly, we kept coming back to one important question. What does this process do for people taking part? They spend 40 hours together, learning, deliberating, questioning, and deciding. They meet people they would likely otherwise never encounter. They hear from perspectives that challenge their own. They also learn about a topic they might not have any knowledge on. They get a chance to share their own stories and listen to the stories of others, and ultimately have the opportunity to affect how a decision is made. The impact of an assembly also doesn't end with its members. Behind every session, there are facilitators, organizers, volunteers, and support staff whose work makes deliberation possible, and who are often quietly transformed by what they see. This brings together people in a way not many other processes can. Here we also have some just brief reflections from Assembly members. In Vilnius, one member said that the Assembly was very special for me. I came here not only to represent the opinion of the citizens, but also to find an argument for myself to change my habits. In Kerewan, an Assembly member reflected on the impact of being selected through a civic lottery. Because none of us chose ourselves, nobody felt higher than the other. That made people speak freely. In Deschutes, an Assembly member expressed how this was the first time in my life that I ever felt like my voice mattered. While in Esch, we heard how the process transformed them. My views have changed quite a bit. I started off being cynical. I ended up being a believer of something like this. And it actually gave me hope in the government and the authorities.
And now for our main recommendations, we've broken them down into 3 different audiences. So first, for cities considering first-time assemblies. Framing this as an ongoing process, not a one-off event, opens the space to learn, build skills, and invest in the infrastructure that an embedded model requires. We know city employees have little time, so showing that these skills will pay off because the process is repeated, it is key to making the case for investing the necessary time and effort. When approached this way, the learnings from these first experiences should also be well documented, shared openly, and used to inform future assemblies. Next, the coalition of people who are engaged before the process kicks off should be broader than direct stakeholders or the ones receiving the recommendations. Getting the support of a broad range of decision makers makes the process more politically legitimate, and it also helps decision makers learn about a process that they might not have heard about before, and maybe one day they will be the one commissioning an assembly. Second, for practitioners supporting democratic innovation, as an organization, you must develop capacity, networks, and create conditions necessary for scaling. A diverse coalition of supporters and advocates goes a long way for sustaining momentum beyond a first assembly. We also saw that convening large groups of practitioners, including those working outside the direct context of each partner, proved to be really fruitful in building connections that last beyond the first assembly. And experiment with technology. We don't believe facilitators should be replaced by AI, but there are tools like the ones we mentioned that make the process better. Don't be afraid to experiment. The field is called democratic innovation for a reason. And finally, for funders of deliberative democracy. We call on funders to broaden their investment priorities beyond process delivery and to reconsider how success is measured, not by the number of assemblies funded, but by long-term development of actors, institutions, and culture that make them possible. We also then have to realize the timeline for this kind of change is measured in decades, not in months or years, and grant timelines should also reflect this. And finally, it's time for ambitious philanthropists to step up and realize that they could be catalyzing another democratic future.
So in conclusion, citizens' assemblies are not just a useful tool for citizen engagement. When designed and delivered well and embedded as new institutions, they can shift power. When given a mandate, they can become democratic infrastructure. They should exist as permanent forms rather than one-off experiments. But the conditions for this do not emerge on their own. They require investment in local capacity, in ecosystems of practitioners, in evaluation, and in the political groundwork that makes recommendations impactful. They require funders willing to measure success over years and decades rather than project cycles, and commissioning authorities willing to commit to what comes after the final session. Citizens' assemblies are also possible beyond government. They're increasingly being used in financial institutions, schools, museums, universities, labor unions, and workers' cooperatives. Wherever communities face complex decisions that affect people's lives, there is a case for bringing a randomly selected representative group of people to learn, deliberate, and recommend. What makes all of this possible is sustained investment in the ecosystems that support this work. Democratic renewal will come from embedding citizen deliberation into how decisions are made. These cities and regions show that another democratic future is possible. Thank you.
And thank you, James and Hannah. An incredible amount of work that went into that, and it's of great benefit, I think, to the entire field. So we're grateful. And now we get to move on to the next fun portion of our conversation today. And we're going to kind of frame this a little bit sort of tangential to the structure of the paper, and kind of ask for a conversation amongst the panelists about the why, the how, and the now what. Why was this something, having an assembly in your community or region, why was that something that you felt was an important innovation to introduce? How did it come about? And then the how portion is really more about what ended up being different. What innovative practices do you feel led to change? And finally, we'll really focus on that now what portion. What change did that create? Not just in policy, but also attitudes, social impact, perspectives, and what comes next for your communities. And I'd like to start out with Beatrice, and kind of what did you feel was so important to try something new and innovative in your community, and how did that translate to civic leaders? What felt different about this than other citizen participation in Vilnius?
Hello, everyone. I'm Beatrice from Vilnius, Lithuania. Thank you, Josh, for that question. I think we here in Vilnius have been experimenting with different ways of engaging citizens in dialogue about urban development. I work as an advisor to the chief architect, and my role is to look for these new ways of cooperating. We have a long history of very conflict-based relationship between local communities, developers, and the city. It's been a very formal conversation based on what law says we have to do, and there has not been much room for open human connection that is non-formal and more based on dialogue. So we've been experimenting with different ways, hosting more workshops or open houses or pop-up things on the streets. And I think we just also kind of reached that level where we were looking for new ways to relate. But we also had so many other strategic questions, which I think politicians often try to avoid because they're just too hard to open. So one of them in Vilnius for us, and still is now, is sustainable mobility. As many cities around the world, we're trying to reduce our CO2 emissions, and transport is one of the biggest emitters of the gas. So what we need to do as a city is to flip the pyramid, as they say, and to base our mobility on walking, public transport, and cycling. And this change is very difficult because it means it's not enough to write a strategic document and base it, have the KPIs for 20 years and then hope that everything is just going to happen, because it involves changing people's behavior. So it's very hard. There's no sort of rule book or easy ways to do it. And you have the changing political cycles, and each politician, as you all know, wants to, be good to their citizens and have their vote the next year. But yet change that we need is really difficult to do, and it brings a lot of conflict in town. So yeah, it felt just like the assembly could maybe offer a new way to talk about it, to talk about this topic, but also so many others can be opened, and just offer a new way of just talking, because we have been sort of also, I think, relying too much on social media and the conversation there, and conversation there is often very critical. Also, you don't know how much you can trust that conversation, and I think politicians rely way too much on what they see there. um, but it still plays a role, so I would be very happy if we see more politicians listen to what happens in the citizen assemblies instead of what happens on Facebook feeds.
Yeah, thank you. And Tammy, that point about these sort of create opportunities for elected officials, for administrative officials to tackle thorny issues that they might not be inclined to do otherwise. Can you comment a little bit on, from your perch, what made a regional cross-jurisdictional body like yours willing to put your credibility behind something like this that was very untested?
Watching communities get more and more fragmented by misunderstanding and thinking that the goal is agreement, when really the goal is the discussion. The goal is the ability to have dialogue where we learn from one another with differing perspectives and have an opportunity to be in a safe space where we feel that we are being heard. And so for us as a regional government, it's finding a way for our local elected officials to have trust in the ability to open themselves to asking questions and being vulnerable in a space where they may not be able to answer all the questions. They don't have all the answers. And so by being able to create a space that is both safe and inviting for the community at the same time as it's safe and inviting for our elected officials, in that builds trust, which then opens a very different conversation in being able to come up with solutions to really prickly issues. So for us, that was a motivating factor. Can we be in the space where we create that opportunity and maybe lift some of that apprehension? And so for us, that's where the win lies. How do we make sure that it happens?
Yeah, that space where trust can be reinstituted, I think, is a theme that we can all focus on a bit. And I'm really curious, Liz, from your perspective, coming from such a multilingual international town with Esch in Luxembourg, how did that differ, do you think, in your context?
I think for us, the question of languages was not something unexpected because it's a reality in everyday life. It made it more, I don't want to say more difficult, more interesting, let's call it like that. But I don't think, and there I agree 100% with the paper also that James and Hannah wrote. If multilingualism is part of the design from the start, it doesn't really create barriers. It is something to think about, but I think if you live in a multilingual country or region, then you are aware of it anyways. I think it is definitely worth overcoming this barrier or this first barrier, let's say it like that, because it creates such a solidarity, and not only between language groups, but as groups in general, because people also know how to switch between groups, and it kind of pushes the limits of the social groups that were established beforehand, to include people more and more. So I think that it can definitely work, and work very well. You just have to plan for it.
And there's a question that's already in the Q&A about how technology was used in some of these processes. Can you comment just briefly on how technology led to the ability to actually hold simultaneous translation and get multilingualism?
Sure. I'm also then promoting another paper that James and Hannah wrote on multilingualism in that context. Yes, we use DemBrain, which is an AI platform that listens to groups. So how we used it is that we had different working groups in different languages working on the same topic, more or less. And the platform can then listen to the different conversations, get the main points, where are the tensions, what are the challenges, what are also maybe hidden gems that facilitators every time can note. But what it does is that it compares them at the same time instantly across groups, across languages. So our facilitators all were speaking most of the time, were speaking all the different languages, but this is super helpful when you have facilitators or people that maybe don't speak the language of the group, so they can then immediately capture the essence of discussions of the entire assembly if they are even physically apart from each other, and then maybe see if you need to redirect or if you want to go more into details on some topics or others. So for us, it was very helpful. I was a little bit skeptical in the beginning because of the language barrier. That was my biggest hindrance, I would say, because Luxembourgish isn't an official EU language. And so far, there aren't really any AI tools that understand Luxembourgish. DemBrain is the first, and it does it quite well because it does a lot of context work also. And I was a little bit scared that maybe the participants, the members of the assembly, wouldn't want to talk as openly if they knew that they were recorded. However, that was something that wasn't an issue at all, as it turned out. We presented very transparently during the first session, and we gave them the choice. We said, is this something you want to work with? This is a pilot project, like the entire process itself anyways. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't, and we will just abandon it. And the members all agreed that they were fine with it. And we could see that they also saw the added value of it. So yeah. I think it's an interesting point how technology can help in those situations as well.
Most definitely. Thanks. Satang, I'm curious from your perspective how this process was introduced new and innovative methods to engage the community. You know, we heard that you were bringing in representatives from potentially, dozens of different communities all together into one place. What developed from this process that changed the way you look at community engagement?
Much for that question, and
that was for
hello
Satang.
Everyone. Yes, thank you. So I am Satang, and I work with the Great Green Wall Frontline, the Gambia. Our citizen assembly was focused on climate change. I'm sorry, it's raining a little bit here, so maybe my network would be unsteady, but for now, I will continue answering the question. So during our time when we organized the Citizen Assembly, we went through a series of processes. But one important process that we couldn't leave behind was the fact that over the years, with my experience and my co-facilitators' experience organizing community-led activities, we usually contact a certain person or an office to do the mobilization for us. For example, we can contact the regional youth office if it's youth related. We can contact regional women's bureau if it's women related. We can, contact different officials based on what the mission is about. But there's something that we usually see in all these activities is that participants are usually repeated. So you having a program on young people, you see the same faces over and over and over. So it's like they select their friends or their families or their acquaintances. So during the citizen assembly, we felt like this should be different because we wanted it to be different, wanted it to be as random as possible. we also wanted to give chance to as many people, many random people to participate as much as possible. So we went through a rigorous process, and this was suggested by the DemocracyNext team, James, and which we were skeptical about doing in the beginning, but later when we did it, we were thankful that we did it because let me explain the process first of all. Through a sortation process, what we did was we were supposed to work in the North Bank region, and the North Bank region has 7 districts. So we went forward to look at the different villages in each district. There were certain districts with 50 villages, 56 villages, 60 villages. We listed all those villages down, and then we had to randomly pick 5 or 6 villages out of the lot. So when we did that, we now went into these villages and we randomly went to, 5, 6 compounds, and we selected few people. We explained to them what we were about to do, what it is about and all of that. And all our 30 participants, our final 30 participants, were all participants who were new to this kind of a thing. One challenge that we had at the time was we selected women during the first stage of the sortition when we went to the villages, but there were certain women that their husbands were not willing for them to participate because it was residential and it was a 5-day event, so it was difficult for women to make that decision in the absence of their spouses. And for those that their spouses were present and they were supposed to seek permission, majority of them did not have the permission that they required to participate in the citizen assembly. Notwithstanding, out of the final 30 participants, we had 50% female and 50% male, and it was a very wonderful one. During the citizen assembly, we had different types of participants. We had the youth, we had the elderly, we had women, we had men, and of course there are different voices in the room, but that only happened during the first day, where we had the oldest participant who wanted his decision or his voice to be the final in the room, and it couldn't happen because we were promoting democracy, we were promoting respect for each other's opinion despite age and all. So in the first day also, women did not want to participate much. Most of them, this was their first time coming to something like this, and they didn't think their voice would matter in the presence of men. But we were able to change the mix because the first day we focused more on building relationships, getting to know each other, and then the remaining 4 days was when we got into the work properly. So it was really amazing, changing the perspectives of people and helping them participate towards our democratic process and making them understand it does not matter whether they're educated, male, female, youth, elderly, they can always participate towards nation building. So this was one of the most interesting things that we did during the citizen assembly. And even though in the beginning we were very, very skeptical, but we really were proud of the result at the end of it. We had different people. We had teachers in the room. We had farmers. We had fishermen, businessmen, businesswomen, oyster producer groups from women. We had a local authority like the alcalde, the village heads. We had different people. Different voices. A huge group of people from different backgrounds. And the beautiful thing is, when it comes to climate change, it's like everybody is aware, because what the local people will do, they compare the past to the present. So they've seen in the past rain was consistent, harvest was good, everything was going well, there was not much heat as it is now. And now rain, as I'm speaking right now, rainy season was supposed to be at its peak right now, raining cats and dogs in the Gambia, but it hasn't even properly started after 2 months delay of rainy season. And it's usually extremely hot in this country, especially in the North Bank region, where people used to cut down trees for firewood, charcoal, and sometimes even for building. They even go to the extent of cutting mangroves for building and fencing. And a lot of people, due to the irregular migration, a lot of families sold their lands and sold their businesses that they use for farming to sponsor their sons to go through the back way so they can get into Europe. And due to this, they've also stopped farming. So they now depend mostly on their sons or family members who are living abroad. So there's a lot of economic activities that are no longer functioning in this country because we've destroyed our natural habitats. And this was what the Citizen Assembly was focused on. How do we ensure we revive our natural habitats while creating livelihood and dignity out of what we have? So yeah,
Satang,
I hope that
you've
answers
got
your
the
question, Joe.
It does very well, thank you. And I have to say, you've got the best audio background of any of the panelists. Happy to have a rooster on board with us today. You know, something that you've alluded to there, and in the paper we talked about the transformational change that this can bring along, not just in institutions, but in individuals, particularly those who are involved. And Anka and Alex, I'd love to hear from you a bit on sort of the arc of your journey here. What made you want to participate, and what changed over the course of your experience with the assembly up to this time? And feel free to riff off of one another. Anka maybe, or Alex, I see you're off microphone. Maybe we'll start alphabetically.
Yeah, so for me, for a while, I've wanted to get more involved in my local community, and it was touched on earlier, but for the most part, all of my interactions were on Facebook, which is just people yelling at each other, you know. So it was kind of a stepping stone. When I got the letter, I was excited. I got in there, but I was also expecting the same type of interactions as I was used to online. And it was nice to be wrong in all aspects of that. It kind of renewed my faith in humanity a little bit and showed me what I already knew but kind of forgotten. And that is that despite any of our backgrounds, we're all just people. And when we see a problem, we're all trying to find the best solution to that problem. And when you get in with productive conversation, it's a lot harder in person to how can I be as mean as possible to these people around me kind of mentality. And it was the whole process was very enlightening for me personally. And it put my foot in the door to get more involved and stay more involved. And it's been great.
I mean, I'll highlight there. I mentioned it earlier that Alex is a member of our COCAP steering committee. He and two other
Yes, sorry.
delegates joined as well. And which is, I think, this sort of evidence of what can happen when the inspiration that comes from participating in one of these types of processes and seeing the connections that are made between one another, between the residents, the delegates, and the institutional leaders. There's that trust that is rebuilt. And Anka, would love to hear from you on that. Seems like we've got a big delay, or maybe we can't hear you at all right now, unfortunately. Maybe we'll try again in a few minutes and see if maybe your connection is a little bit short. So keep trying. Or maybe even, Anka, you could try to dial out and back in. We'll give it a shot. But we're going to move on to well, we've got a few more minutes, I think, for our questions before we dive into those that are coming up in the Q&A. And just a reminder for everyone out there, chat is for chatting, Q&A is for queuing, for questioning, and then we'll come back to those. As we look ahead, so we've talked a bit about the genesis of these four processes and assemblies, and a bit of what changes came out of them. Now looking ahead to what happens to help them become permanent. What sort of institutionalization? Where does this new kind of democratic infrastructure come from? And Tammy, I'd maybe start with you because you are the head of the organization that is my fiscal sponsor. Hi, boss. I think it's fascinating to see how, and in different ways, in all of these different assemblies and locations and others around the world, that this is taking place. How have we gone from this one-off assembly to really building the foundation for permanent infrastructure?
Thank you, Josh. And I love that we're in partnership together. And I loved the children running in the background too with the roosters. It just gives life to this work.
Yeah.
And it just speaks so much to community. I would say that it's making sure that we start with what is the value that we are adding if we're going to be taking time, and whether that time is for elected officials or that time is for community members, how do we make sure that we set that piece before we make the ask? In my opinion, there's the question of, am I going to have the community telling me what it is that I need to do? And there might be factors that they won't understand. And how do I actually grapple with that as an elected official? If we start with, what are you hoping to achieve by hearing from your community? And we start with, how do we do that in a way that you get the most value out of those that you're serving? And so we sort of start the conversation before we get to what it is that we really need, which is buy-in, ownership, support. And I also would encourage us to think about our non-traditional partners. The business community has a lot to gain. The general community, whether that's your schools or whether that's the faith network, there's success in being able to build community together. And so as we look at who might be able to invest in making sure that we have the seed money to continue this, I think it's not looking at just local government and saying this is part of democracy, this is part of hearing from your community. I think it's the fabric of what it means to be part of the community. And I encourage us to be thinking similarly to what we are. How do we engage our foundations? How do we engage our local elected officials and city county budgets? How do we engage the state? How do we engage one another in the business community and faith community to all lean in on how might we embed this into how we actually show up as a community? So that's where I would answer.
A real ecosystem kind of whole of society approach, it sounds like. Beatrice, from your perspective in Vilnius, how is that playing out? Is there energy behind repeating these type of processes and building something into the civic structure in a way that Tammy kind of discussed there?
Well, I think that's still up for discussion. So it was our first assembly last year, and I think we took some time to sort of work with the recommendations that we got. We created a report, reporting on each recommendation that we received on how we will work with it. And I think, now in autumn is going to be a good time to come back to that conversation and think of what happened last year. How do we feel maybe that this process could be integrated into the system? I think for us, my point will be, when we will have that conversation with political leaders, is maybe we could have a policy which requires to do it each political cycle, at least once. And then see where we can go from there. Because I think from what we created and what we've seen last year, I think the municipality at the moment is capable of doing it once 4 years. If we would want to do it more often, we would need to think about additional resources, like having people working specifically for this, maybe a separate department. Also think about the financing of the assembly. But doing it each 4 years is doable at the moment. And I think it makes sense because it requires then each political leaders to have at least one deliberative process in their term.
Yeah. I'm curious. I've heard other practitioners in the field talk about really trying to approach elected officials while they're campaigning, perhaps before they've even taken office. Do you have any champions or ambassadors within your elected officials there in Vilnius who are supporting this?
Well, we always had the current mayor and the deputy mayor support the assembly. They were the ones who sort of agreed from day zero to the idea. And the deputy mayor was the one who opened the assembly and received the recommendations himself from the participants. So the current ruling sort of parties are in favor of the process. And I also went to the council, to the whole council. We have around 56, I think, council members for the city. I presented the assembly and how it's going to work out to all of the parties. And I felt that none of the even the opposition was supportive of the idea. So I think in the beginning we really had the support, and I think we managed to make it non-political. I think it's it's one of the points that I was thinking while reading the paper of Democracy Next as well, that it's very important not to make assembly as one of the tools that is carried by one of the political parties, because there's a really big risk then of them sort of owning it. While I think citizens' assemblies are just a tool for collective intelligence. So we have like ChatGPT for artificial intelligence. I think citizens' assemblies are a tool for collective intelligence. And how not to make it political, yeah, I think that's why it's very important to have these bipartisan conversations with all the political leaders and help them see the point in the tool. And then maybe they can use it. One party can say we will use assembly in this, and the others say assembly in that, but it's not about the assembly itself. So we will see how it goes if we manage to push that conversation further this year.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm seeing one of the questions in the Q&A from Tendisai, and we'll see if I've got that name correct, maybe, asking about sort of what you allude to there. What happens within all of the various participants and stakeholders in an assembly after the assembly? There's this question referring to what can actually be sort of the development of apathy if there's a feeling in particular amongst the delegates and the citizenry that the recommendations aren't being followed through on by local governments. And I know we've got a couple of examples in the audience today in Jennifer Chase and Kristen Hansen, and some of the processes taking place in the US right now, where they're building in advance the relationships and the pathways with state level legislatures and legislators to be able to ensure that there is some direct follow through. And I'd be curious to know, Alex, in particular, as a delegate, what your experience has been with the follow through from local governments, and how that's shaping your opinions and your practice on the steering committee.
Yeah, so I think a lesson kind of I learned from the Deschutes one was maybe more preparation, which is something we're focusing on right now with the steering committee, making sure that we actually have the framework ready to go at the end to help the delegates afterwards, the ones that want to stay involved. There was a little bit with the youth homelessness assembly that we did, but where we did get a good amount of response from local government, and they looked over the recommendations and they sent out a letter. As far as kind of follow through on their part, it felt like they just kind of picked the ones that they're already working on, which is fine. I mean, yeah, okay, good. You guys working on stuff, so that makes sense. But yeah, I don't know, maybe a little bit more structure, which would be good to really feel like the recommendations kind of landed.
Yeah, I think that's another place where the new field of deliberative technologies can also be leveraged to ensure that there's a dashboard of sorts, or some way to track and measure what's happening at the institutions who are receiving the recommendations. Liz, on your side, how do you see what the next days, months, years look like for the opportunity to build something more permanent?
Well, we only wrapped up about 2 weeks ago. So I can't say that much about implementation just yet. However, and there I maybe want to go back again to the paper also. I think that the outcome and the quality of the entire process, of all the work that people put into it also, which we definitely shouldn't forget that people are spending a lot of their time and energy on. The quality of what happens to the recommendations starts or depends with how you start or how you lay the first tracks. So it depends how much, in our case, it was the political administration, the mayors, the councillors, how much they are on your side or on the assembly side, and how committed they are also. We were very lucky in our case that it was pushed heavily by the entire political assembly of Esch, so also opposition leaders, and there was only one party that didn't want to go along. So at least we could say, and it was something that we pushed from start with the help of the expertise of DemocracyNext also, we were able to push the politicians, that they committed and openly and in front of microphones, they committed to implementing the recommendations. So we could also tell the members that, which I think also helped with motivation. They knew that they were taken seriously. It was one of the very first rules that they set for themselves, also that they only want to continue the work with the assembly if they can be told or be ensured that they are taken seriously, which I think is a fair point. If you commit to all your weekends and afternoons to work on such a project. So knowing from the start already what you want to do and having this commitment, I think was for us a big game changer. The mayor has already said that he wants to continue this assembly, maybe not every year, because also that's an issue of resources, but that he wants to now also have the members present their own recommendations to the councillors, and they committed to have a review of the state of recommendations and their implementation until by the latest before next summer break. So in a year's time, they have to give an update to the assembly on the implementation of the recommendations. We, with the help of DemocracyNext, we also had a workshop to see how we could maybe create a legacy for assemblies, be it in Esch, but for me personally, it was also very helpful to have it for the national context. And there we learned also from other practitioners in the field, notably from Paris and Ostbelgien in Belgium, the German-speaking community in Belgium, but also Brussels citizen assemblies. And I think that's a very important part also, to keep this exchange, this network, and exchange best practices, because we learned so much from the case of Ostbelgien that we can actually implement maybe for Esch. They change always, they keep some of the members permanently and then exchange them for others, so that you have a little bit of this learning already, so the entire brain doesn't go, like you don't have to change every single time again. So that was very helpful. So I think these kind of networks are very important as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think this leads us to another question from the Q&A, and I'd like to turn to you, Satang, about, post-assembly, you're working on a regional level here with a lot of unique existing processes. What does the future look like for the region, and how does storytelling play a part in that, in getting more people involved and feeling as if they can connect to what the delegates and the participants experienced?
Thank you so much, Josh. I think for the North Bank region, a whole region, and we're selecting only 30 participants to be members of the Citizen Assembly, for me, that is very small. It meant like the selection really has to be random, like I explained to you previously. And it also means that there's a lot of people that do not have the chance to participate. But most importantly, it empowers the 30 participants to be more productive, to also be, more representative of the communities that they are from. So post citizen assembly, we have them in a group called a working group because our recommendations came in different folds. We created only few recommendations, and what we did with those recommendations was we tied them to either a policy or a law, because our politicians or leaders are fond of making an excuse of, oh, this does not align with the law, this does not align with so policy. So what we did was we had to take the national development plan and that the government themselves created and certain laws that the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change is working towards, and we tied these recommendations to, because we do not want to hear excuses of this does not align with our goal, it does not align with the law. To be very honest, we say people hold the power, but in the Gambia here and many other countries in Africa, final decisions are with the politicians. If whatever you're doing does not align with them, with their offices or with the laws particularly, they are not going to support you. And this is how they frustrate efforts of civil society organizations. So we came up with different committees, and most importantly, they are divided into different committees, but all the 30 of them are in a group called the Working Group, the North Bank Working Group, and we are working towards North Bank restoration systems. So in these working groups, they are responsible for climate change related activities, for monitoring it, for working with the village development committees, working with parks and wildlife and forestry to ensure that our natural resources are being protected. So they formed the working group, and as I speak, we are working with them to ensure that next week we have a meeting on mangrove planting. So we're going to have a training of trainers on mangrove planting, because the belief, especially, and this came out during the citizen assemblies, that people believe that mangroves are naturally planted by God, and when they cut them, they will always grow again. So unfortunately for our communities, they've cut a lot of mangroves, and still these mangroves are not growing as they expected. So now we are talking about planting. We are trying to shift their perception that this is not God grown, it is human grown, and we can restore our lands. So this is according to what the action groups are working on, the working groups are working on, but they also conduct series of sensitization programs based on what they learned during the citizen assemblies. And they're also trying to make sure that they follow up on the implementation of the recommendations. So we work with different offices during the implementation phase of this citizen assembly, and we have thorough support from the governor's office and the deputy governor's office and other stakeholders such as parks and wildlife and forestry. Our frustration is we are not very sure if some of these sanctions would be put onto some of the people that are going against the law. For example, we say no to tree cutting, and then this is what the law says, but we still see people doing that, and then they will you report them, they will go behind the counter, and then they will bribe an official or something like that, and then they can scot away free for committing that crime. So this is something that has been frustrating efforts of the working group, for example. And yeah, but since the assembly, they've been working rigorously in their working groups and the different districts that they are from. In every district in the North Bank region, we employ 2 district coordinators, and they work directly with these people. And currently we are in the summer, and they are running school summer programs, tree planting exercises, sensitization programs, and many other things. But most importantly, these are participants that never thought that they could participate in things like this. They thought these were things not for them but for other people. They just have to focus on daily life, and other people will just come and talk about climate change and all. But now they are the ones doing it, and they are really impressed with the skills and also the knowledge that they gain. So we continuously engage them, and we continue to work with these stakeholders like the governor's office, the minister of climate change and natural resources office. So we are still trying to work. We still have a lot of challenges we are facing, but the good thing for us is that we chose the right people despite the randomness of our selection. These are people that are willing to work, willing to dedicate their time towards this cause.
I think you just said something there at the end that's really profound, Satang. it doesn't, in the end, you could try to select for a group of people who would be ideal. But what it turns out is that when a group of everyday people comes together in the right space, with the right facilitation, with the opportunity to solve a problem, the collective wisdom just comes out, and it's really powerful to watch those transformations that take place. You also talked about that feeling of having a voice that matters. That was the quote that was in the paper from one of our delegates here, from Brenda, who said that she never felt as if her voice had mattered, and now she does. And she's involved in a great number of more civic involvement initiatives now too. Being conscious that we've got a few minutes left and some growing number of questions here, I'm going to address one of them on my own, which was beyond local assemblies. Is there any thought about developing processes for regional or national assemblies? And I know this has happened already in Europe in many cases. What we're building here in Central Oregon is regional. It's a 3-county region plus a confederated tribal area. I can tell you that the complexities increase immediately once you start dealing with more than one elected body and an administrative function, but it's worth the work. Also, I think right now there are at least 5 states in the US that are either holding, have just held, or will be holding an assembly. That's Maine, Connecticut, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and Nevada. We're also exploring the possibility of doing that here in Oregon. Let's see. Any other questions? Anyone on the panel looking at questions too, feel free to jump in. I see there are a lot of questions about the use of technology in various contexts. I'm going to probably wave off on trying to answer very many of those right now, unless someone from DemNext wants to jump in with a succinct answer. But we'll point out that they have published a paper on this in the past, and it is really a growing field, and we're all kind of experimenting still. Anyone from DemNext want to chime in there?
I think we're good. But the one that stood out to me was around the increased quality of deliberation while building civic muscles. But I think we've also talked about that and touched on that a bit through Liz's interventions on using DemBrain in the process as well. So maybe we can leave it there.
I'd like to offer then one more opportunity for all of the panelists to just think for a moment about last thoughts from your experiences and what you would, if you were to look ahead 2, 3, 4 years in your community, what might have changed? And keep in mind, we've only got a couple minutes, so this is just paint a picture a bit from your experience. And I'll look at who looks the most prepared. Alex, what have you got for us?
Yeah, I don't know. For me, it seems like the most powerful part about it wasn't necessarily the recommendations and how they were implemented by the local government, but how energized some of the delegates got afterwards, and how it kind of jump-started us into being more involved with the community. And obviously, yeah, to do more of them, it would be nice to get a little bit more power behind them. But for me, like thinking on it, just like the idea of every time we do one of these, if you get 4 or 5 people who just get really engaged and then continue to be involved, that number will grow exponentially. It's not addition to the community, it's multiplication. And just the sky is the limit when we think of getting change in your local communities where things actually matter, instead of arguing about national stage stuff that doesn't really affect you in your day-to-day life. So that's where I think it's powerful.
Building the civic muscles and leadership skills. We're seeing that a lot. Beatrice, how about from your side?
I think a very similar point. I feel that there's a lot of fear of just having the open conversation and inviting people, of fear of open conflict, fear of not being able to moderate the conversation. And in that fear, there's so many stories that are being created about people, and we're putting labels and we're getting into these silos. And I think everything is so much more simpler when we just get together and start speaking. It's not just between the city and the citizens, but in between the citizens as well, between different ages. And I think it's very healthy to see how varied the city is, and that have that experience that even if we are varied, we also can have agreements, and we can have also disagreements, but it's not that serious. So, and we can live with those disagreements. I think that's very important to experience. So I also think that this, for me, this was one of the things that I see why assemblies are crucial in today's world.
Thanks. Yeah, we talked here about the idea that we can remember how to disagree agreeably. And I hear that. Liz, how about you?
Yeah, maybe to come back to what Beatrice just said, is working in this field, I'm on the other side, so I know the happy faces at the end of such a process. So I'm glad that we were able to bring that to the city and to raise the awareness that if you give people the chance to participate, they will. In a context where we often just brush people off and say, oh, no one is interested in politics, or in local politics especially. I think in our context, where there are so many people excluded from voting and being able to vote, this has shown that people show up if they are given the platform to do so.
Thank you. Satang, briefly from your side, what do you hope the future holds for your region?
Well, from my side, I think like citizen assemblies are the future of Africa. To be very honest with you, we are not like this part of Africa that I'm from is not very used to citizen assemblies. We had other form of assemblies like the Bantaba, which is the predominantly for men. We have the Kafo, predominantly for female, and they usually take the setup of citizen assemblies, but they are not consolidated. So we have men taking certain decisions, and we have certain decisions where women are exempted from, and we have another group where women can make decisions that concern them and their families, but at a lower scale, because in our culture, men are predominant decision makers, and women are usually followers. So we just need to work here in Africa on the side that I'm from to inculcate the idea of citizen assemblies and equalities in our citizen assembly. Although we agreed, James, during our last deliberative with the other people from other sides of Africa, that we were not going to mess up with these settings, but I think it's very also important to see how best we can sync these two settings, that is the women kafo and the main bantaba, so that we can bring everything together and help ourselves in our democracy, especially in the Gambia, where it's still in a new democratic dispensation. So I think we're still unused to the idea, but we're looking forward to the future and working with civil society and government to ensure that we push the idea of citizen assemblies in the Gambia.
Thank you, Satang. And Tammy, over to you to bring it home.
I would say that this is hard work and heart work. And as community, I love that Alex mentioned, and Satang as well, we're building community. It's intentional. It's at a time where we sit behind screens so often and can say and do whatever, it lifts that veil and brings people together where they can see their hearts together and see where they're part of a community together and see where they can add value together and see where they can provide solutions to really challenging community issues. But at the same time, even more important, they have a connection to, to community that moves away that isolation and that feeling like you don't matter at a time where we all in our communities are wondering, what value do I bring and do I matter? And I think that this is a process of saying, yes, every voice matters. And it's an opportunity for us to celebrate that.
Thank you. I can't think of a better place to end. We really saw how these various processes can bring us to some real, as technical and complex as they are, bring us to some real personal transformation. And I want to hand it back to James and Hannah for final comments. And thanks everyone for your rich participation in the chat.
Thanks so much, Josh. Wonderful moderator as always. And thank you to everybody who joined us today. These reflections were, yeah, even better than I could have imagined, to be honest. So I just want to say thank you so much, and for all the work that we've also done together, and to really see how everything has kind of finally all come together. Just a final thought on, how I would see this in my own place in 2-3 years as well. I would love to see that more people know about these processes. I know that that's our vision and goal at Democracy Next, but this is something that I see as the biggest limit to, always having to convince people that this is a worthwhile process and that it is worth the payoff, or that there is a payoff of doing it. I've seen that with my own eyes and all of these processes, and my wish is to continue communicating that out to the world and convincing more people that this is really worth the investment for a better future. Pass it over to Hannah.
Yeah, no pressure to end it, right? No, I think someone in the chat brought up the word power, and we always come back to that at Democracy Next, shifting power to citizens. And I think that's what I would like to leave this Zoom room with today, is that at the end of the day, we're really interested in moving power out of the hands of large corporations or corrupt hands and moving it into the hands of citizens who we believe, and I know, have the capacity to make these types of decisions and to deliberate meaningfully. And so thank you all for being here, and stay in touch. Please follow us, add us on LinkedIn, send an email. We love to chat and have more conversations about this.